Hello, everyone. I wish I could see you in person, but I'd like to thank Tom and everyone who helped put this conference together. And I'll hope to see you in the next year. To ease into my talk on the Glass of Blessings, I first want to draw your attention to familiar passages from the book. The first is when Wilmette describes her entrance to the church function where Father Ransom is being introduced. Wilmette stresses the categories into which people can be placed, or one might say she takes note of how people sort themselves. I noticed that the lay people had arranged themselves in little groups, each clearly distinguishable from the others. As a kind of centerpiece, there was old Miss Beamish, large and black, at the same time brooding and quietly triumphant, presumably because Father Ransom was to live under her roof. She was surrounded by various elderly ladies in yellowish-brown fur coats, one of whom I recognized as Miss Prudhoe. Near this group, I saw Miss Greenhill, the clergy's late housekeeper, in close conversation with her friend and crony, Miss Spooner, the little verger, in her familiar peacock blue hat, which had a large paste replica of the bird pinned to the front of it. I also noticed two well-dressed middle-aged women with a young girl. All three were chinless with large aristocratic noses. Near them stood a thin woman with purple hair and a surprised expression, as if she had not expected that it would turn out to be quite that color. She was rather surprisingly in conversation with a group of nuns from the convent in the parish. There seemed to be a kind of segregation of the sexes. The various young girls and boys moved freely between all groups. The largest male group was dominated by Mr. Coleman, the good-looking, fair-haired master of ceremonies, with his cronies, some of whom I recognized as fellow servers. The two church wardens and the secretary and treasurer of the parochial church council were together in a corner, looking rather important. In the middle of the room stood the three clergy. Father Timms and Father Bode were evidently leading Father Ransom round and introducing him to the various groups of people. Wilmette's surprise at seeing the purple-haired woman talking with nuns suggests that perhaps these groups are not as settled as she imagines them to be. Indeed, in an earlier passage, she suggests that groups need not be mutually exclusive. It occurred to me that one could perhaps classify different groups or circles of people according to drink. I myself seem to belong to two clearly defined circles, the martini drinkers and the tea drinkers, though I was only just beginning to be initiated into the latter. Thus, Pym sets out very early on her interest in the breaking down of seemingly exclusive groups. Wilmette's journey to join the circle of tea drinkers will involve her in the process of erasing such clear distinctions. She comes to see the Anglican Church as a place where all can be included, and that she might even participate in this increased inclusivity. For those of us familiar with Pym, her close connection to the Anglican Church in both her fiction and her life is very much a given. Her interest in the church began early. While at Oxford, Pym regularly attended service at St. Mary's, even noting down her reactions to the sermons she heard and looked to for guidance. During wartime, while a member of the Wrens, she persisted in finding congenial church services to attend. Jane Williams, author of a recent essay on Pym, concludes that Pym's novels display the Anglican parish understanding of the importance of place or community where people of all kinds are accepted as they are and can be a gift to each other in all their imperfections. But my emphasis today will be on Pym's interest in how the church could participate in changes that result in increased inclusivity. As a settled churchgoer, Pym herself participated in the changing demographic of the Anglican Church. In the 1960s, St. Lawrence's, where she was a member, underwent an infusion of congregants from Nigeria, and Pym served as godmother to one of the young women, seeing her through the process of baptism. When membership declined precipitously and the church closed in 1971, she wrote to Philip Larkin that there's something I should like to write about. After retirement to Finstock, Pym, an active member of Holy Trinity Church, participated as well in the upkeep of nearby St. Peter's, where she occasionally did some tidying up of the graves, or could be found grubbing away at the left-hand side of the porch. In the last years of her life, Pym habitually visited Oxfordshire churches. She was fascinated by the additions and restorations made over the centuries, those physical signs of historical processes, and an obvious analog to the church's change over time. Focusing on Pym's hard-won attitude towards change in the church, David Cockerell reminds us that religion, which is creative and alive, is always about change, and the dangers of idealizing ideas and practices from the past particularly as opposed to golden age, were certainly already present in biblical times. Thus, in Pym's later novels, Cockerell finds her recognition that the challenge posed to the church by a changed world must be met. If the values and ideals of the Christian church are to survive, they now have to do so in a world which is far more challenging and perhaps more painful than that earlier comfort and security of lunchtime masses. A Glass of Blessings, titled after the poem by 17th century Anglican priest George Herbert, obviously rests on firm Anglican ground. Nevertheless, in it, Pym makes an assertion, delivered in her characteristically quiet way, that the church should welcome, participate in, and even instigate social change. Paradoxically, then, the firm ground must necessarily shift. In the course of the novel, Pym alludes to two seemingly very different contemporary controversies and suggests that the church should respond in both instances by fostering increased inclusion, most explicitly, at a time when homosexuality was being very publicly identified as a moral threat to society. Wilmette posits in so many words the acceptance of male homosexuals into the church. Less explicitly, by means of the novel's events, Pym answers yes to a question being debated by the Anglican Church. Should the church become in communion with the Church of South India? In her portrayal of these two analogous examples of inclusion, social and ecclesiastical, the principle of spiritual dynamism, of the kind Cockerell alludes to, can be seen at work. To supplement the logic of this intertwined social and ecclesiastical dynamism, Pym provides us with a narrator whose character develops analogously. Wilmette's actions, although purposefully taken, lead her in an unforeseen way to a more inclusive perspective and a broadened sense of her own identity. To arrive at this altered view, Wilmette travels a path, representative of one that not only the Anglican Church, but that Britain more generally might follow, a path that by crossing seemingly impermeable but false boundaries that separate groups of people, leads towards an understanding that membership in such groups needs not be exclusive. Thus, Pym portrays, in varying degrees of detail, three analogous examples of movement towards increased inclusion, all bearing out lines from a favorite hymn. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. With Wilmette's discovery that Pierce Longridge has a male domestic partner, Pym brings into her fiction an interest in homosexual men and couples that had personal resonance, both longstanding and current. Her association with gay men began as far back as the early 1930s during her time as an Oxford student, in the person of Robert Liddell, her friend and unflagging supporter throughout her life. The male partnerships that Pym brought directly from her life into the pages of Glass of Blessings caught her interest while she lived in the London suburb of Barnes. From her window, Pym watched the comings and goings of young men and their various friends who lived in a nearby flat, those whom she nicknamed Little Clive, Squirrel, and Blondie among them. For A Glass of Blessings, Pym turned one of these men into the minor character Bill Coleman, master of ceremonies at Wilmette's church, and another became the physical and sartorial model for Pierce's male companion Keith, who is referred to as Squirrel in Pym's draft material. Another male partnership that came to intrigue Pym during the year just previous to writing Glass of Blessings was that of author Denton Welch, who died in 1948, and his companion Eric Oliver. Pym placed Welch's journals and novels on a list of most enjoyed books of 1954 and recorded the 6th anniversary of his death on December 6th of that year. She was intrigued, Hazel Holt explains, by his moody, difficult personality, and fascinated, as she always had been by such relationships, by his life with Eric Oliver. Perhaps Welch influenced Pym's creation of the mercurial and occasionally harsh Pierce, who, like Welch, chose to live with a partner from a lower social rank. The years 55 to 58, during which Pym wrote and published A Glass of Blessings, were not at all propitious for same-sex relationships. Just previous, British authorities were especially hostile to male homosexuality. An anti-homosexual diatribe appeared in the Sunday Express, 1953, declaring that this widespread disease has penetrated every phase of life, including, quote, politics, literature, the stage, the church, and the youth movements. The columnist called for rousing the social conscience of the nation to ostracize these social lepers. None other than Julian Amory, Pym's friend from her younger days, now a Tory politician, pronounced the need for a moral revival in England that would combat any tolerance of homosexual practice. The position promulgated by the Church of England Moral Welfare Society was that homosexual acts were sinful, but not necessarily punishable by the state as criminal, a stance that by 1954 some Tory lawmakers were coming to hold. Following similar logic, the committee established in 1954 to look into the question, recommended in 57 that private homosexual activity between consenting adults be decriminalized. Even so, the recommendation was not made the basis of law until 1967. The concurrence of these public events with Pym's writing of A Glass of Blessings, together with her simultaneous reading of Denton Welch, and the attention given to her young neighbors makes it all the more likely that she was quietly making a political statement as to the direction British society should move. Upper middle class Wilmette's embracing of Pierce and Keith as a couple is Pierce's nudge to her audience that Britain should loosen its stricture against homosexuality. Moreover, Pym points to the place of the church in leading the way to a more expansive social outlook. By the novel's end, Wilmette has envisioned the Anglo-Catholic Church as an institution that should welcome her new friends, and she goes so far as to wish that she had had the courage to invite them to the Corpus Christi service. This desire results from Pierce's accusation at the emotional height of the novel and its turning point, that Wilmette is incapable of loving everyone, particularly those outside her select circle. If Wilmette is to be taken as representative of British society generally, Pierce's comment about her inability to love has the broadly religious meaning of universal love or charity towards all, of whatever class or social orientation. When Wilmette imagines welcoming both Pierce and Keith as part of the Anglo-Catholic Church, Pym suggests that the church should rightly extend its umbrella to include all humanity according to this principle of charitable love. Pym's reference to the contemporary theological controversy over the proper relation between the Anglican Church and the Church of South India might easily be overlooked. She doesn't overtly set out the terms of the issue. Yet again, Pym quietly enters a debate that had personal resonance for her. In 1955, while drafting A Glass of Blessings was underway, the precise nature of the relation of the Anglican Church to the Church of South India was a matter of controversy in which Pym was very much engaged. She records in her notebook that she came close to quarreling with her friend Bob Smith over this very debate. The Church of South India had been formed in 1947 by an alliance of Anglican and other Protestant churches, Congregationalist, Methodist, Presbyterian in South India. The issue of inclusion lay at the heart of the debate. Would the Anglican Church consider itself in communion with the Church of South India? To put it more broadly, the Anglican Church was considering a move towards increased inclusivity by joining with other Protestant denominations. Reverend C.S. Milford, entering into the debate in 1954, took the affirmative side of the question. He reminds his readers that the very concept of alteration, as opposed to a continued rigid conformity to a set dogma, is a long-standing Christian tradition, one that is rooted in an understanding of the Holy Spirit as a dynamic rather than static force. Milford argued for recognition of the dynamic movement at work in South India, and he concluded with the warning that opposition to this movement would, and this is a quote, fetter the Holy Spirit at our peril. He also framed the actions of the Church of South India as a show of charity towards their non-Episcopal parents, and urged a response in kind, a response to the work of the Spirit as we have seen it in them. His argument very explicitly applauds this show of charity that he sees in the inclusionary effort made by the Church of South India. Through the readiness of the Anglicans in South India to recognize the orders of other uniting churches, 500,000 people have already been brought within an Episcopal church who were previously outside. And that's a quote from him. Pym addresses this controversy in her portrayal of the clerical figure of Marius Ransom when he comes momentarily under the influence of his colleague Edward Sainsbury, who opposes the movement towards communion. Although Sainsbury never makes an appearance in the narrative, we are told he resigns his position, and this is Pym, because he considered that the attitude of the Anglican Church towards the Church of South India no longer entitled it to be regarded as a part of the Catholic Church. Joy Grant explains this. Father Sainsbury had joined the Exodus of 1955 in protest against the Anglican attitude to the Church of South India, some of whose clergy were not episcopally ordained. Ransom, however, ultimately rejects his colleague's view. By concluding the novel with Ransom's introduction as vicar of an Anglo-Catholic church, Pym implicitly approves the inclusionary effort and the spiritual dynamism represented by the Anglican Church's decision to accept an in-person relationship with the Church of South India. Reverend Milford argues that the movement of the Holy Spirit, while ongoing, cannot be known immediately, but will unfold over time. This movement is embodied in Wilmette, who undergoes a dynamic and mysterious process of change at the individual level. Wilmette's sense of her own identity expands, while she simultaneously comes to embrace the inclusivity of the church in principle, if not in direct action quite yet. As Wilmette expands her view of herself, she comes to represent the view of the Anglican Church as a force for social unification and inclusive acceptance. So although Pym has Wilmette set for herself a purposeful agenda for her life, following it will have quite unforeseen circumstances. On the day of her 33rd birthday, Wilmette very consciously resolves to undertake a program of action. After a very ritualized birthday dinner, she decides that my autumn plans to take more part in the life of St. Luke's, to try to befriend Piers Longridge, and perhaps even go to his classes, ought to keep me fully occupied. Wilmette's plan yokes together, incongruously as it turns out, the intriguing Piers and the Anglo-Catholic Church. The latter element of the church will be represented in the person of Mary Beamish, one of Pym's trademark excellent women who unselfishly serves others. The novel's trajectory traces the interwoven process of Wilmette's halting and vexed relationship with both characters, leading to a conclusion that, in an unexpected manner, broadens the narrow track of this cosseted woman. Wilmette's first impulse in following her agenda is to recover the excitement of bygone days, and she deludes herself that in doing so, she will be performing good deeds. During reminiscences shared with Rowena, the nostalgic coloring of the women's remembered past casts their present life in a rather dull shade. We learn of their histories, beautiful young women who met and found husbands when they joined the Wrens during the war, a time both women look back on with erotically tinged pleasure that Wilmette longs to recover. Rowena puts Wilmette's feeling into words. Oh, this weather, it makes one so unsettled. One ought to be in Venice with a lover. But Rowena, the voice of practicality, then renders a verdict Wilmette does not want to hear, that the staid quality of their lives is not going to change. Neither of us has ever had a lover, or is ever likely to. The ideas got translated into something remote, even comfortable now, like morning coffee with a woman friend in a country town. Wilmette resists this restrictive conclusion. I suddenly felt that I wanted to break out of the mold of respectability into which Rowena had cast me and say, speak for yourself. Wilmette's effort to seek out a relation with Piers constitutes her somewhat desperate and ultimately wrong-headed attempt to deny what Rowena says and to regain some of that romantic excitement and disruptive sense of possibility she felt in her Naples days. Rowena's husband, Harry, flatters her, making it clear that he too would like to revive the erotic excitement of times now past. The pull to revive a past full of romantic possibility is too strong to resist. There could be no harm, Wilmette tells herself, in having lunch with Harry or walking with Piers in the park. Wilmette falsely construes this quasi-romantic adventuring in religious terms as the performance of good deeds. She disingenuously imagines herself as a kind of excellent woman performing useful tasks in a manner consistent with her attractiveness to men. I can show Harry what a good wife Rowena was, and as for Piers, drifting and rootless, perhaps often drunk. it might be that my friendship could be beneficial to him. Although their long lunch together, complete with a romantic walk and late tea, hardly conforms to her plan to exert a curative force on Pierce, she consoles herself with the idea that perhaps I had helped to make him a little happier by my company, and that might be something. However often Wilmette assures herself that her attentions are doing Pierce good, clearly their relationship is self-serving, important for her, because their meetings revivify the emotions from those giddy days in Naples for which she longs to return. Pym sets up the novel's turning point so as to reveal the false promise underlying Wilmette's pursuit of a relationship with Pierce. After the fateful tea, during which Keith has made up an unexpected third, Pierce gives his condescending approval to the distraught Wilmette's choice to take a taxi rather than a bus. Dear Wilmette, so deliciously in character. Don't ever try to make yourself any different. Pierce sees her as a woman who travels through life in a protected and privileged fashion, choosing not to acknowledge people outside her ken. And he insists, oddly, that she should remain so. In this post-tea conversation with Pierce, Pym conflates the issues of sexuality and of class. Wilmette's objection focuses not on the fact that Keith is a man, but that he is not of Pierce's class, or of her own for that matter. But Pierce, why did you choose him of all people? I shouldn't have thought you had anything in common. In choosing Keith, as Pierce goes on to explain, he has expanded his world. He finds the notion of spending all his time with people like himself entirely unappealing. He had much rather come home to some different remarks from the ones one's been hearing all day. As the discussion reveals, Wilmette's fundamental objection to Keith is that he's not a member of the group of people one actually knows. Pierce's admonishment gets to the heart of the issue, but there are others in the world. In fact, quite a few million people outside the narrow, select little circle that makes up Wilmette's world. His harshly expressed estimation of Wilmette is couched in terms of charitable love, categorizing her as one of those people less capable of loving their fellow human beings, with the faintly ameliorating qualification that it isn't necessarily their fault. Pierce sees Wilmette as an affluent and conventional housewife privileged to live within a confined world, oblivious to those outside it. Growing out of this version of a narrow life, then, will require an alteration to the categories into which she herself places people. Unexpectedly, it is Wilmette's discovery of Keith, Pierce's partner, that allows her to take more definite steps towards a broader point of view and sense of her own capabilities. Studying a picture of Keith modeling a sweater in a knitting magazine, Wilmette finds his beauty capable of inspiring devotion, a word that has application to her own life. This thought led me to consider the religious and secular meanings of the word devotion and how devout did not mean the same as devoted. I'm not sure why this was, but it seems suitable that my life should have this confusion in it. Wilmette's discovery of Keith has led her to recognize the confusion that in her efforts to revitalize herself, she has confused the categories of the romantic and the religious, substituted erotic for charitable love. But rather than sort out the confusion in meaning, she sets aside her thoughts of Pierce and refocuses her attention on her new friend in the ecclesiastical realm. Thinking about Mary, the dowdy young church worker and excellent woman who has requested her help to buy a summer wardrobe, gives Wilmette a comfortable feeling. In turning to Mary, she will have a chance to provide help to one who has asked for it. And so exercise and receive, or engage in the practice of charitable love. While Wilmette eagerly seeks out an attachment to Pierce, she initially resists friendship with Mary Beamish, a person who is much more alien to her sense of herself. But it is this relationship that will prompt Wilmette to move forward into unfamiliar territory. Wilmette's quest to be useful at St. Luke's proves difficult because Mary represents for Wilmette the essence of the useful life so antithetical to her own, the kind of person who always made me feel particularly useless. She was so very much immersed in good works, so splendid, everyone said. The pattern of helpfulness that this excellent woman provides is far from congenial to Wilmette, the elegant woman who cannot but see Mary as hopelessly dowdy. And although it is difficult to say which is worse in her eyes, rather too good to be true. Pym presents Mary as an embodiment of good deeds. She quite literally gives her blood to others. Although Wilmette admits that Mary's most recent donation to the blood drive seemed to me in my nastiness the last straw, she proves surprisingly amenable to the excellent woman's encouragement to do the same. In this episode, Pym shows Wilmette, with the help of Mary, stretching her boundaries a bit, finding herself among the unwanted company of the burden-bearing type, middle-aged and tired-looking, the sort of people who would take on yet another load in addition to all the others they already bore. No one would mistake Wilmette for one of those burden-bearers. Yet the progress of the novel works in its halting way to break down the categories into which both women are placed and place themselves. Mary's story is the obverse of Wilmette's, and each woman wishes in a very tentative way to become more like the other, and yet Wilmette balks at the merging of her world with Mary's. The women travel from the blood bank, Mary's territory, to the fashionable women's clothing store, where helping Mary buy a new dress falls well within Wilmette's area of expertise. She unerringly steers the unfashionable woman towards the choice of a black dress, a daring new color for Mary, yet also inarguably suitable for any clerical occasion, and even pushes her to buy a string of pink pearls to give her that glow that, she assures the doubtful Mary, surely all women want. But coming closer to Mary also prompts Wilmette to resist this crossing of boundaries and draw a thick line separating herself from the excellent woman. When Mary confesses to a love of poetry and even quotes some lines, Wilmette draws back reflexively. I could not bear to think that she might have read my own favorite poems, and my one idea now was to escape from her as quickly as I could. She cannot abide the idea that she and Mary might belong to the same world. I looked at her dispassionately and saw almost with dislike her shining, eager face. Her friendship offered to me. What was I doing sitting here with somebody who was so very much not my kind of person? It was my own fault for getting involved with St. Luke's, I told myself unreasonably. After they part, Wilmette takes special care to assert what she sees as her very distinctive identity, making a frivolous purchase of truffles, even thinking rather defiantly of Mary as I did so. She returns home relieved to be back in a comfortable position to entertain a handsome man, Marius Ransom, with a glass of high-quality sherry, and to hear him characterize Mary as a fine person. Wilmette would not like to hear herself so characterized, but she need not worry, because it was inconceivable that anyone should describe me in this way. The narrative eventually culminates in a reversal of field, leading Wilmette away from her fanciful relationship with Pierce and breaking down the barriers between herself and Mary. At the same time that Wilmette's understanding of her relationship to Pierce shifts in a humiliating and self-revealing way, her relation with Mary strengthens. She had imagined in a deluded manner that she could be of help to Pierce. Now she finds herself sincerely wanting to be helpful to Mary. Upon hearing of old Miss Beamish's turn for the worse, Wilmette is annoyed that Marius Ransom dismisses her desire to help in any way other than to offer sympathy. I felt rather chilled, for I had not meant anything so indefinite as that. I suppose I imagined myself busy in a practical way, cooking meals or running errands, even being what people call a tower of strength. When news of the death comes, Wilmette responds immediately, do you think we should go to her? Would there be anything one could do? Again, this impulse is thwarted, and Wilmette can only send flowers and write a note. But these frustrations bring about her resolve to be as helpful as I could to her in the future. The date of the funeral during which Wilmette acts on her resolution occasions a turning point in the women's relationship. Wilmette helps Mary serve tea, stays until all the visitors have left, and listens as Mary reveals her plan to test her religious vocation by living with the nuns at St. Hilda's. This act of intimacy unites the women, but at the same time, the conversation leads Wilmette to keep Mary in a category far different from herself. For although I had learned to accept the idea of the religious life for a few people, it seemed terrible to contemplate when applied to oneself or anybody one knew at all well. Wilmette's formulation of people one does or does not know at all well recalls her view of Keith as belonging quite outside her circle of acquaintances. Pym brings the women close again with Wilmette's visit to Mary at the convent. When Mary inquires after a change in Wilmette's demeanor, Wilmette discloses, "Sometimes you discover that you aren't as nice as you thought you were, that you're in fact rather a horrid person, and that's humiliating somehow." But Mary assures her, "I suppose a person would be even nicer if they could make a discovery like that and admit the truth of it." Unlike Pierce, Mary implicitly encourages Wilmette to view herself as able to change for the better. Unexpectedly as well, it is through her connection with Mary, rather than with Pierce, that Wilmette finds liveliness restored to her. A liveliness of the kind that does not involve backtracking to her youthful days, but going forward in a way that extends herself, a sense of herself. Pym portrays this vividly at the Corpus Christi evening service. For Wilmette, the church has a special beauty, which she has played a part in creating. The church was looking very beautiful, and Mary and I had helped with the decoration of it in the morning. Her presence had made it easy for me to enter the charmed circle of decorators, and I had even been allowed to help to lay down the carpet of leaves and flowers which covered the nave, and looked almost as striking as the altar with its many candles embowered in green lilies, in green leaves, lilies, and carnations. Owing to her friendship with Mary, Wilmette is now thoroughly integrated into the following tea service, no longer moving self-consciously from one group to another, as she had very early in the novel, but helping to serve and exchanging knowing bits of conversation and asides with a full cast of characters, including Mary, Mr. Bazin, and Mr. Coleman. In contradiction to Pym's former assessment of her as living in a very narrow existence, here at the church, Wilmette has a growing sense of her place amidst different sorts of people. It was both exciting and frightening to think of how many different worlds I knew, or perhaps had knowledge of, would be a more accurate way of putting it. I cannot say that I really knew the worlds of Piers and Keith, or even of Mr. Holman and his husky, if it came to that. It seemed as if the church should be a place where all worlds could meet, and looking around me, I saw that in a sense this was so. If people remained outside, it was our, even my duty to try to bring them in. In the midst of it all, she thinks, if only I had had the courage to ask Piers and perhaps even Keith to come this evening. And what a beautiful acolyte Keith would make. And yet his world was probably too far removed from that of the church to make it feasible. In this regard, Pete seems to be a rather a lost cause, as Wilmette finds out when she invites him to take tea at her house. He lets her know in no uncertain terms that he never goes to church. You see, Wilmette, I don't believe in God. But their conversation also makes clear that Keith can easily be incorporated into Wilmette's world as now constituted. After all, Wilmette has lived closely with her mother-in-law, Sybil, who openly professes herself an atheist, but who also does good work for charitable causes. Listening to Keith go on about his own history, Wilmette realizes, seems to bring Pierce's world nearer to my own, where people seldom looked like Keith, but were often as boring. In view of these collapsing categories, the separate worlds of which Wilmette now has knowledge are perhaps, as she is able to realize, not so very different. The matching scene to the gathering at the Corpus Christi service, where different worlds meet, is set in the coffee bar, the Cenerentolo, where Keith works, and where Rodney and Wilmette drop in at his invitation. Surprisingly, and to emphasize the uncertain categories into which groups are defined, Wilmette's friend from St. Luke's, Mr. Bazin, makes an appearance at the coffee bar, where he is known by Keith as a regular, who keeps house for a lot of clergymen. This information leads Wilmette to reflect on the permeability of so-called distinct worlds. How odd it was that at all the time I had been wondering about Pierce's domestic life, such an unlikely person as Mr. Bazin could probably have told me all about it. In a striking use of analogies, Pym collapses the distinction between the religious and secular realms and also casts a very wide historical net, harking back to religion's ancient roots and suggesting a continuum, a dynamic movement, connecting these two earliest days to the present. When at the coffee shop, Mr. Mason makes ready to report gossip from the clergy house, Wilmette thinks of the Cenerentola in religious terms, with its hissing coffee machine tended by two handsome young men who seemed as devout as any acolytes. It would not be inappropriate to speak of the church in clergy house matters. Wilmette next makes an imaginative connection between Keith's coffee bar and the garden of the retreat house, where Wilmette had visited Mary, two very different seeming settings. It was, one might say, a far cry from the garden of the retreat house to the Cenerentola coffee bar. And yet, in a way, it was not such a very far cry. For the Cenerentola, with its dim lighting and luxurious greenery, reminded me of that part of the garden where the compost heap stood in the mysterious green twilight under the apple trees and where the bees had swarmed. Catching a glimpse of Keith at his work, she sees his dark eyes peering, as in my imagination, through a screen of leaves. Here Wilmette is referring to the vision she had of Keith's face in the back garden of the religious retreat house, a secluded and fecund place that conjures up images of fertility. I imagined all this richness decaying in the earth and new life springing out of it. There seemed to be a pagan air about this part of the garden, as if Pan, I imagined him with Keith's face, might at any moment come peering through the leaves. Placing Wilmette at the outer reaches of the retreat house, at the very foot of its garden, Tim widens the space of the Anglo-Catholic institution to include its most primitive and fundamental roots in pagan fertility rites, with the Greek god Pan imagined as Keith. The beautiful young man who does not attend church or believe in the Christian God becomes in Wilmette's vision the face of the most inclusive of all divine representations, an embodiment of the vital force of nature. In the same way, the beehives in the garden of the retreat house prompt in Wilmette reflections that bring together religious practices, both ancient and current. I remembered the old saying about telling things to bees. It seemed that they might be regarded as a kind of primitive confessional. At the chapter's end, Wilmette reiterates this connection, seeing the natural world as the source of current religious understandings. After the bees swarm, she sees a priest taking notes and is pleased to think that here, in this pagan part of the garden, he might have found an idea for a sermon. In this thematically fitting image, the swarming bees, which move to a new location with their queen, represent an image of expansive change. The colony enlarges itself in this manner, leaving part behind to remain on the original site. The image drawn from the natural world is clearly applicable to the relation of the Anglican Church and the Church of South India, and to the view that the church should expand in an increasingly inclusive way, as Wilmette suggests. In the narrative conclusion too, the relocation of Rodney and Wilmette, when they move from Sybil's house to find one of their own, represents a similar dynamic movement. When Sybil and Professor Root surprise the couple by announcing their engagement, with the additional news that Rodney and Wilmette must move out of the house they have been sharing with Sybil, they find themselves in the role of a newly married couple, searching together for a place to live. In this way, Wilmette recaptures within her present married life the excitement of her youthful days, with the addition of her newfound friend Keith, of whom she has really grown quite fond, as a constant companion in choosing the furniture for her renewed life, and as one of the blessings that fills her glass. Thank you very much. This is a very excellent conference, and I hope to see you not virtually, but in person next year, either perhaps in Cambridge or maybe in Oxford.